逐浪，在海天之间，人脚下涛涌浪飞旋，为梦想启程，高扬起风帆，我们同船渡破浪向前，激流勇进在潮头之巅，开新天无曲间重现，新世界的旅途美丽又遥远，我们共开创风光无限。
The development of life on Earth began more than 500 million years ago. It took almost this entire long period for life to advance far enough for the dawn of humanity to occur. The breakout of humanity into becoming the high-order intelligent species that it became coincided with the beginning of the modern Ice Age epoch, roughly 2.5 million years ago. During Ice Age epochs, the Sun operates in low-powered mode, with 70% less energy being radiated by it, while it radiates significantly larger volumes of cosmic ray flux. Cosmic rays are single events of highly energized electrically charged particles. Most cosmic ray flux originates at the Sun. Some cosmic ray events pass clean through our atmosphere, and some even pass right through our body. As they pass through us, they generate an electric current by induction, which appears to enhance our neurological systems that operate to some degree electrically, including our cognitive systems. So it was that humanity became a resourceful, intelligent species in the shadow of 2.5 million years of cyclical ice ages, with large volumes of cosmic ray flux. We became so successful in our development on this course that we proliferated into 8 distinct human species, of which we are the last one and the sole survivor. The reason why we are the sole survivor is rooted in the nature of the Ice Age phenomenon. Living is challenging at the best of times under a 70% less radiating sun. The climate is cold and dry during the glaciation periods. We also know from ice core examinations that precipitation is dramatically less during glaciation conditions, as much as 80% less. Plant growth becomes devastated by this double whammy of cold and dry conditions, while plant growth is what all life depends on. In extreme times of such conditions, humanity becomes overwhelmed by the conditions that it can no longer live with. Without food, people die. Without water, people die. An extremely harsh case of this type occurred during the second last ice age. It started around 195,000 years ago, when the already harsh climate conditions of the Ice Age began to deteriorate. An extended, extra-deep glaciation stage began. This stage is referred to in archaeology as the Marine Isotope Stage 6, or MIS 6 for short. While most of Africa became a desert at this stage, and thereby became unsurvivable, A small group of people who had lived at the southern tip of Africa had evidently survived, so that modern humanity is their offspring. A small group had survived in caves at a place termed Pinnacle Point. They survived living off the sea. A warm ocean current from the more tropical northern Atlantic would have brought enough warmth to the region for precipitation to occur and also to support some sparse vegetation to grow. A few hundred people may have lived in this region as the result of the uplifted climate. They were the sole survivors of tens of thousands who were known to have lived in earlier times, who perished for the lack of resources that their primitive cultures had been unable to supply, in spite of the growing intelligence of humanity. The selection of caves at Pinnacle Point for their living might have been the leading edge of intelligent reasoning that humanity had developed at that time. It saved their existence. The population collapse at this time became of immense magnitude, which the other human cultures had obviously failed to avoid, for which they became extinct. Population collapse events of this type, where the world population falls back to minuscule levels in the shadow of collapsing climates, are referred to in archeology as population bottleneck events. The particular bottleneck event that the people at Pinnacle Point had survived likely had occurred in the general time frame at around 150,000 years ago. The massive population collapse during the bottleneck period illustrates rather dramatically the immensely devastating impact that a major climate collapse can have, which even the most intelligent species could not survive, which humanity evidently had been at that time. This means that when the climate dies, people die with it. The only option that exists under such circumstances to avoid a climate-caused population collapse crisis is to transfer the food production infrastructure out of the natural environment into a technological environment that the climate collapse cannot affect. This means in modern time, because agriculture is the main food source for humanity by far, that agriculture becomes placed into indoor facilities and into regions of the planet where agriculture is physically secure from climate calamities. The people who hadn't lived at Pinnacle Point during the bottleneck population collapse 150,000 years ago didn't have this option open to them to build themselves a new world. They lacked the capacity to do so. Consequently, they perished. All but a few hundred of the entire population of humanity perished for this type of reason. But we in modern time do have this option open to us today to build us a new world. We have the technological capability to build us a whole new world that the Ice Age climate cannot affect. With this capacity, we have the power at hand to avoid the greatest potential population collapse crisis that appears otherwise assured, which may be upon us in the 2050s. We are presently progressing towards the next ice age phase shift with a 7 billion world population, of which few would get past the population bottleneck. The reason is simple. We grew up to become a 7 billion population on the Earth in only 3 centuries, from 500 million to 7 billion. This population achievement had been made possible by the massive upramping of the Sun in solar activity, which gave us almost 300 years of global warming. We also had the scientific and technological capability developed at that time to utilize the warming environment to the utmost. We began to operate powerful agricultures. But this global warming that gave us this grand life is now collapsing again. A sharp down-ramping of the solar activity has begun. The Earth is getting colder and drier. The climate that gave us the power to support us as a 7 billion world population is collapsing fast, globally. And as the climate collapses, the food supply collapses with it. And with it, too, the population density collapses. We are facing another population bottleneck of gigantic proportions. People need food and water to live. Without them, they die. We are on the fast track of losing both food and water. In this regard, the people at Pinnacle Point had an advantage over us. They had lived in one area in which the natural environment was rich enough to support their existence, and this under the worst possible circumstances. Their place may have been the only place in the world where this was possible, because all of the rest of humanity died out at this time. The few surviving people had the advantage over us in that they had available to them what we won't have in the near future, which we have the power to create, but refuse to apply that power. For fresh water, the people at Pinnacle Point had probably discovered a wellspring nearby that had provided enough fresh water to support a few hundred people. But we are 7 billion people in the world now. We need a correspondingly larger wellspring than just a hole in the ground. We need to have a wellspring that's big enough for the global scale, and we need it when precipitation diminishes by 80% worldwide. In fact, we should have it already started, because drought conditions are increasing in many parts of the world. Fresh water is critical for human living at any time and in any place and for all life. This fact is already felt in California. The big drought began in 2010. Agriculture is severely impacted thereby, while the needed water is plentifully available, not too far away. Nothing is being done to get it to where it is needed. The outflow of the Columbia River, for example, could solve the California water crisis easily if the water was conveyed to California with the technologies that we have available. The technological diversion of the outflow of the Columbia River within a large-scale artery floating on the sea would be, for California, the equivalent of the people at Pinnacle Point finding a wellspring nearby or building one. The irony is that we have the capability at hand in the modern world. Nothing is being done along this line to fulfill the human need and use this capability. Nor does anyone care to cause the needed steps to happen. We face the same irony also on the global scale. We know that a phase shift to the next ice age will collapse rainfall by 80%, but we refuse to make the preparations for it. The process would be the same in principle as bringing water to California from the Columbia River. The source would have to be larger, of course, from the global scale to meet the global needs in an ice age environment. The equivalent of the wellspring at Pinnacle Point would then be the outflow of the Amazon and Congo rivers and so on the world scale, distributed globally. It would be relatively easy on this basis to supply a world of 7 billion people with fresh water during the desert conditions in glaciation times. So why isn't this done? We have the resources to build this big, worldwide, big enough to supply the needs of industries and agricultures for the whole of humanity. Why don't we do it? People say that hell will freeze over before such a worldwide water project will be built. But if it isn't built, the refusal to build this infrastructure and to build it big means that the giant population collapse that could be avoided will thereby be invited. This means that the refusal to build this infrastructure is akin to accepting the death sentence for almost the whole of humanity. That's the context in which the building of what is needed will likely happen, because there is no joy in being dead. The people at Pinnacle Point also had another advantage that modern society is determined not to have itself. The people had a home in which to live during the climate collapse period. Society doesn't have the slightest intention today to provide itself the equivalent. When things got rough for the people at Pinnacle Point, they had a cave to go to. Modern society has no place prepared to go to when the northern regions from Canada to Europe to Russia become uninhabitable by the cold, or even before that, when agriculture begins to fail. Modern society has committed itself to become aimless refugees because the building of the needed 6,000 new cities for society to have a home to migrate to is not happening. It is not even being considered. The needed grand-style building project, the grandest ever imagined, for society to live and to have a future, is being laughed at today as an utopian dream. The people at Pinnacle Point, however, would laugh at us instead, for our smallness at heart. Another key element that the people at Pinnacle Point evidently had going for them, which modern society refuses to even consider, is food. The few hundred people at Pinnacle Point had lived largely off the sea. The sea was rich enough to support those few hundred people. But the sea won't support 7 billion people for 90,000 years. Only large-scale, high-tech, indoors agriculture has the capability to nourish a society numbered in the billions, maybe 10 or 20 billion strong. The people at Pinnacle Point had those amazing, down-to-earth advantages over us that we presently refuse to even consider. That's why the people at Pinnacle Point survived, while modern society assures itself by its inaction that it won't. While no provisions are presently considered for any of the infrastructures to be built that would assure our continued living in the shadow of the already ongoing climate collapse, the corresponding population collapse is thereby actively invited to happen. This means that it will happen unless society is reversing its course. A middle path is not possible. But why is society so staunchly committed to its path to doom? The culprit here appears to be science fakery, a form of denial of the very truth that has been physically measured and is known. The political world is awash with such types of fakery that denies reality and denies humanity. Science has been especially targeted to become trapped into fakery where nothing is actually real by so-called experts and authorities who, in many ways, proclaim that the real world doesn't really exist, even while the opposite is obvious. It is possible for humanity to step away from all forms of fakery, even from expert physicists who don't believe in physics anymore. In moving forward from this dead end, society has the mental power to read the writing on the wall and to find itself inspired to build for itself the new world in which the ongoing climate collapse cannot affect it, whereby the greatest ever human population collapse can be avoided. That's what science fakery denies. Science fakery is a death trap that would prevent humanity from having a future and trap it into a terrible doom. Society, the world over, as human beings, has the capacity in full to step away from this fakery and honor truth and life with love for our humanity and embrace reality with joy and with power and experience peace.
勇敢逐浪，在海天之间，人脚下涛涌浪飞旋，为梦想启程，高扬起风帆，我们同船渡破浪向前，激流勇进，在潮头之巅。 开新天无惧间重现，新世界的旅途美丽又遥远，我们共开创风光无限，扬帆未来，我们携手向前。 就在面前。 见，让圆圆的月亮托起我祝福。友谊的海洋宽阔无边，心心相印，像幸福彼岸，远向广阔漫漫海面。听蔚蓝色海潮澎湃我歌声，和平的航线永无终点。扬帆未来，我们携手向前，迎接新日出，未来就在眼前。扬帆未来，我们携手向前，迎接新日出，未来就在眼前。扬帆未来，携手向前，迎接新